Cool. All right, so Jackson's Shenandoah Valley campaign, March 23rd through June 9th. The goal of the Valley campaign was to protect the valley, but to also keep soldiers from joining up with McClellan on the peninsula, because the Peninsula campaign was what we would call a pincer movement. I believe I've explained this before, or a double envelope, and that is to have forces surround their enemy. We learned about a successful pincer movement that McClellan and Rosecrans had performed in Western Virginia at Philippi, or Philippoli, in now not Western Virginia, but now West Virginia. Well, this would be a larger pincer movement to basically successfully attack no longer Joe Johnston's army in the peninsula, but now who's in command of the Army of Northern Virginia? Robert E. Lee, right? So Lee has that command. So the goal here is for Jackson to keep these reinforcements, Nathaniel Banks' army in the valley and Irvin McDowell's Irvin McDowell's forces in Fredericksburg, to divert them from providing the support McClellan needs, and obviously we already know that McClellan wants. So, a little information about this right off the bat. This is considered not just one of the most brilliant military campaigns in the Civil War, but arguably one of the most brilliant military campaigns in the history of warfare. A force of 17,000 led by Jackson defeats a force of 60,000, in which Jackson and his foot cavalry, as they're called after this campaign, travel somewhere around anywhere from 10 to 33 miles a day on foot. And it's not just traveling on foot, okay? It's traveling south up the valley of the Shenandoah, north down the valley of the Shenandoah, and over steep mountain passes in the Piedmont and in Appalachia. I'm not sure how much time you've ever spent going across the Piedmont into the Shenandoah Valley, but I'm sure everyone in here has driven across Hampton Mountain and they've made their way into the Valley of Virginia. And if you've ever driven toward West Virginia, you know that very quickly after you've gone past Stanton, or if you've gone past Lexington, Virginia, or if you've gone farther north up toward Harrisonburg, the mountain passes get very steep going into Appalachia very quickly. So that's where this theater of war is taking place. I'll get to your question in just a second. The main command that Jackson has here is the Stonewall Brigade. His adversary in this particular situation is Nathaniel P. Banks. He was the guy we learned about from Boston, who was a political general. His cavalry is led by Colonel Turner Ashby. We're going to talk a little bit about Ashby. Ashby's not going to survive this campaign. He has a series of lightning marches, and some brilliant battles will ensue here. And these are not just fixed battles on flat ground. These are battles in the mountains, and the tactics were pretty intense. And the warfare was pretty intense. It wasn't just shoulder to shoulder fired volleys. We're talking hand-to-hand combat, fixed bayonets. And it sent shockwaves into D.C. because Lincoln's pretty worried, because what we also know is that Shenandoah Valley opens up the door to the back end of Washington, D.C. And if a force of 17,000 are taking on a force of 60,000, then more reinforcements could potentially wind up in the Valley of Virginia and knock on D.C.'s door. Another issue here is that Valley, Virginia is the breadbasket of the Confederacy. That's where a lot of the grain and oats and agricultural foodstuffs coming from. Remember, when we look at ordnance, ordnance was a shining spot for the Confederacy, but when we think about commissary, like food and supply, that was a really frustrating, bedeviling scenario for the Confederates. So losing any food supply that would have come out of the Valley of Virginia would have been devastating. So it's sort of there's multiple motivators here. What was the question?
How could they, how could they logistically get all those people in the valley? Because like I've driven around, on 64 and some of the mountain roads up there. Even today, the paved roads and mountain roads are really narrow. It's also how could you possibly get 17,000 men through there?
That's a really good point, and that's where the knowledge of this terrain and the knowledge of certain mountain pass roads, and the fact that Jackson and his soldiers, they'll be traveling on Macadam Road, they're going to be traveling the more hardtop road. They're going to be able to, they're going to understand not only what mountain passes are easier to pass through, but they're going to also know what bridges are accessible, what areas aren't accessible, and the Union doesn't have that intelligence. Another part of this too is there is a network of spies and home guard within the valley. We can call them home guard or partisans, what have you, that are getting Jackson constant intelligence on Union troop movements. So Jackson's brigade could move through a mountain pass much faster due to the knowledge, not to mention the fact that a lot of the brigade is actually from the valley, so they know the terrain, but they also, I wouldn't call them mountaineers, but they can handle the movements. Not to mention the fact that Jackson inspired them because he won. He provided victories, so his men were behind him. Whereas Banks and a lot of these other guys, they had won victories, but they just didn't know the terrain, and a lot of those soldiers end up on roads that aren't passable. Like a good example would be Fremont. Fremont goes really like 60 miles out of his way to get on good roads, where Jackson's taking roads that they just don't have knowledge of. Does that make sense? Because, even today with asphalt, it's not easy to get. I'm going to show you a mountain pass that they cross that you all probably crossed before. Has anybody ever gone to Shenandoah National Park before? All right. So the mountain pass from Charlottesville, Virginia, to get to Stanton or Harrisonburg, that particular mountain pass through Shenandoah National Park, it is straight up and straight down. And to think that these guys are making those marches throughout this campaign is pretty wild. All right, so let's take a look at the first battle. First battle is Kernstown. This is kind of a tricky battle because it's a loss. This is the only defeat that Jackson had in the war that he initiated. So there are times where Jackson and his brigade will be forced to, not a lot of times, but a handful of times, that they'll be attacked and forced to retreat in defensive positions. But this is the only time in the war where Jackson was on the offensive and was defeated. Kernstown is right outside of Winchester. It's a town, but it's not really a town. It's just a real small, tiny community. It's still a really tiny community. In fact, to this day, the battlefield is privately owned. So if you go visit that battlefield, you have to actually get in touch with the private owner, and they have to let you in the gate. And I've visited there. They don't want you to move a rock. They want to explain it's total private preservation. It's kind of wild, like the owners that they allow groups to go in there and they'll give you a tour, and it's pretty interesting that level of preservation is being done on the private level at Kernstown. So in this particular battle, Jackson will be defeated. The force, it's actually faulty intelligence. He thought that the force was his match or matched to his numbers or less, but in reality, the force was double his size. They were defeated. But the interesting thing about this is that it's a defeat, but it's also sort of a tactical victory because it sends a little bit of a message to Lincoln and to Banks that this army of 17,000 is attacking the larger force not far from D.C. Does that mean that they're going to attempt to march on D.C.? Jackson is pretty decently well known in Virginia at this time. He's not like a national figure at this point. He's obviously known by Lee and his Confederate superiors, but he's not like, this campaign catapults him into national prominence. So the reason that it's a tactical victory is his defeat at Kernstown leads to the success that what he's trying to accomplish is to suck as much of the Union Army into the valley, and that's going to be successful. Now, I did want to point out the general that defeats Jackson here is General James Shields. I wanted to point out Shields because I went to college with General Shields' great-great-grandson. So I thought that was kind of I wanted to pull him into the lesson in honor of my buddy and point that out. So no, it would be great-great-grandson. So yes, all right, I'm just trying to do the generational math there. All right, so more divisions are going to come in, and these are less divisions that are going to wind up with McClellan. The next battle that we're going to look at is the Battle of McDowell. This is actually fought outside of Stanton in a mountain pass between Stanton and Monterey, Virginia. Has anybody ever gone to Snowshoe before? Snowshoe, West Virginia? All right, you've traveled through this mountain pass, and you've traveled over this battlefield, and you probably didn't know it because you were going straight uphill and straight downhill. This will be a battle fought between Jackson and John C. Fremont, the same Fremont that had a command in the West. Banks is going to set up his headquarters in Winchester. Jackson uses a deceptive route, and it can also connect to Andrew's question about moving along the valley. We're going to take a look at the route that he takes, and it's kind of mind-boggling geographically that he takes this route and crosses over the mountain. But the reason that he makes this mountain pass is to get onto a better road to pass through Stanton, Virginia. Stanton, tremendously important railhead to move supply out of the valley and into the valley, and it's a vital rail access point in the Valley of Virginia. Jackson will defeat two of Fremont's brigades at McDowell, and will start a pursuit of retreating Union, but will ultimately cut back east toward the valley. So if you follow along here, we have Kernstown, and we see this is the Valley Pike. You're all familiar with the Valley Pike nowadays, I'm sure. Anybody ever driven Interstate 81? That's the Valley Pike. But look at this crossover to Conrad's store through Port Republic, and then look at this mountain. They cross the mountain pass, right? And then they're gonna move along. And the reason that they take this route is because this is a better road. And again, that kind of answers Andrew's question from earlier. They know the better roads to take. They know they just have more intelligence of the region. So the Union's gonna start to lose divisions to the peninsula at this point. Now keep in mind, this is a couple of months that's gone by between these two battles, and now they're down to 8,000 men in Winchester. This is exactly what Jackson's supposed to prevent. That's why Jackson's going to launch more attacks to try to suck more soldiers back into the valley. So that leads to the Battle of Front Royal. This particular battle is on May 23rd, 1862, led by Colonel Turner Ashby, aka the Black Knight of the Confederacy. And this movement was directly north, and that's down the valley to basically make Banks think that he is headed towards Strasburg. Are you all familiar with Strasburg, Virginia? It's a really tiny town just south of Winchester. Ashby crosses the Massanutten Mountain Range, picks up with General Richard Ewell, Old Baldy's division, and he picks them up in Luray. Has anybody ever been to the Luray Caverns before? So to get into Luray is like up and down and then back up and down again, right? So Ashby, to get Ewell's division, that's going to be significantly important because that gives them the reinforcements to not only defeat Banks at Front Royal, but to take Front Royal from the Union. By taking Front Royal and the loss of Front Royal, now troops are the troops that were being sent toward the peninsula, those troops are going to be turned back around and brought back. That is going to have a moral, or it's sort of demoralizing because they crossed out of the mountains to get to the peninsula, and now they're going to have to double back over the mountains to come back in and continue to fight Jackson. So you have to think about that, that sort of not just physical fatigue, but also mental fatigue in this particular campaign. The First Battle of Winchester, Banks's army tried to consolidate at Winchester. Remember, Winchester changed hands like over 70 times. Ewell's division converged on Winchester. Do keep in mind, Front Royal and Strasburg are right outside of Winchester. The Louisiana Brigade of Jackson's division outflanked and overran the position. Panic ensues. Banks's army is defeated. They'll withdraw across the Potomac, and Winchester falls back into Confederate hands. Jackson's attempt to pursue was unsuccessful. Here we have Nathaniel Banks on the left, and on the right there's Old Baldy, Richard Ewell. So, if we follow the map, we've got Kernstown on March 23rd, the movement of the Stonewall Brigade south or up the valley, the Battle of McDowell on May 8th and 9th. Fremont's forces move north. Jackson pursues, but then moves back east toward Harrisonburg. This is what I've referred to before. Due to the fact that Fremont's having a hard time passing through the valley, Fremont's forces are going to go all the way back north in what is now West Virginia. Close this out. I don't know why that popped up on us. And then we have the Battle of Front Royal on May 23rd. The Battle of Winchester on May 26th. Banks's army retreating back toward D.C. So Lincoln has spent much of the first year of the war studying war manuals, books on the art of war late at night. He defers to his generals, but also wanted to set a trap to catch Jackson in the valley. And obviously, what this probably feels like and appears to you all is a wild goose chase, and that's how it felt for these Union generals. They were completely frustrated by the constant movement of Jackson's forces and their knowledge of the valley in this particular campaign. So the idea here is for Fremont's forces to come from the west. Shields would take 20,000 of Irvin McDowell's men from Fredericksburg and come in from the east. Remember, McDowell is supposed to provide support for McClellan. And both forces would converge on Strasburg, Virginia, which is just south of Winchester, to cut off Jackson's only escape route out of the valley. Banks was to reorganize and pursue Jackson as well. So now you have a three-prong attack of 40,000 federal troops now after Jackson's force of just under about 16,000 at this point. McDowell coordinated attack with McClellan on Richmond is going to now be stalled, and the goal in the valley is to defeat and trap Stonewall Brigade. Did anybody go? Oh, well, did anybody go? Are you kidding me? Most of you went to the Virginia Historical Society with me last year. Does that look familiar to you guys? Do you remember the huge murals in the Historical Society? That's one section of the mural. That section is the spring mural, because remember, all four sides was a season. So it went, winter, spring, summer, fall. Well, this is the spring mural, and it's representative of, or the spring portion of the mural, and it's representative of Jackson and the Valley Campaign. All right, so Jackson moves north, but the brigade will basically slow Banks down. Fremont and Shields moved too slow. Jackson had already passed through Strasburg before anyone got there. Shields was in Luray and in the Valley of Virginia. Fremont then moves down the valley north toward along the Valley Pike, and again, the forces are too small, and Jackson's men were moving along the Macadam roads that were better. Another issue here is superior intelligence from spies like Belle Boyd. Has anybody ever heard of Belle Boyd before? We're going to talk about her in I think lesson 10 when we talk about espionage in the war. She's called the Cleopatra of the Confederacy, or the Cleopatra of the South. She provided a lot of Jackson's intelligence during the Valley Campaign. She also was in the business of smuggling quinine to soldiers, which I'll get into a bit later. So here we have Shields on the left, and we have Fremont on the right.
What is it that you just said?
It's a malarial medical cure for malaria.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. It was really in short supply during the war, especially for the Confederates. The blockade, as we've already learned about, cut off. I mean, it was real brutal for Confederates getting any type of medical supply during the war.
So malaria was a huge issue they had to worry about?
Oh yeah, so many people came down with malaria and typhoid during this war. More people died of disease in this war than they did in combat. So to wrap up the Valley Campaign, we got the Battle of Cross Keys and Port Republic. There are some good, bad, and ugly that come out of this. The good is that at least the good for Jackson's Stonewall Brigade is that they had done exactly as they had planned. They had kept McClellan from being reinforced, and the valley was still in the hands of the Confederacy. But the bad, Jackson's going to lose his cavalry commander in Turner Ashby at Goods Farm near Cross Keys, which is Cross Keys and Port Republic are just outside of Harrisonburg, Virginia. Confederates win both of these battles, and Jackson and the Stonewall Brigade are going to be able to escape and head toward the peninsula to reinforce Lee. There is some good, bad, and ugly for the Union here. The good for the Union is that even though they've lost these battles, they have, for the most part, they've kept their force intact. They didn't take on a massive amount of casualties. They also didn't take on they didn't lose a lot of prisoners of war. But the bad and the ugly here is that they lost all but one of these battles that were fought in the valley. And the ugly is they were the ones that fell into the trap. They set traps, but they ultimately fell into the larger trap of preventing the reinforcement of McClellan and from capturing Richmond as a result of this. The statistic at the bottom, I think, is pretty wild. The Stonewall Brigade covered an estimated 650 miles on foot in the Valley Campaign, and that's why they became known as the Foot Cavalry. So here is the map of the entire campaign on the way out. You see Jackson's forces pass through Strasburg. This is Strasburg right here. They pass through Strasburg before Banks, Shields, and Fremont can reach Strasburg. Shields and Fremont will be on pursuit. They'll tangle at Cross Keys. The loss of Turner Ashby, pretty devastating for Jackson. They'll tangle at Port Republic. Both of these Confederate victories under the Stonewall Brigade, and then the brigade will move east toward Richmond. All right, so on the left here, we've got Robert E. Lee, and on the right, we have Jeb Stuarts Ride. We're going to talk a little bit about Jeb Stuarts Ride in the lesson. What I've done for you guys, I got an article that I posted. Did you guys see that article for Jeb Stuarts Ride? Is that up there? I'd like for you guys to take a look at that. It's related, it's actually written by a history teacher in Mechanicsville, and it was published in the New York Times for the anniversary of the ride. So I thought I would share that with you guys real quick. With Stuart's Ride around the Stuart's Ride around McClellan's army. I'll tell you a little bit about Stuart's Ride. As Lee is waiting on reinforcements from Jackson, he feels like he's a little blind here and doesn't really have the intelligence he needs. So Stuart, who didn't drink, didn't smoke, had no real vice other than he liked to see his name in the newspapers. He was sort of a vain guy. He wore the plumed cap, sort of a bit of a cavalier, so to speak. He said to Lee, don't worry, I'll get you your intelligence. And Stuart is going to do a 3-day ride around McClellan's entire army. All right? He was nearly captured due to flooding at a river ford that he and his cavalry couldn't cross. They had to find a different route along the Chickahominy to cross over. The reason I wanted to bring up Stuart's Ride, what do you think this did for the psyche of the Union Army?
Freaked him out.
Yeah, this freaked him out. It was brazen. I mean, we're talking about a force of 90,000 Union soldiers that are dug in with bad weather and siege tactics trying to take Richmond, and you have this brazen cavalry general with his division riding around your entire army. What does it also say about McClellan? At least the way the newspapers would have reported it, and McClellan would have had to have dealt with this bit of sort of criticism.
They would probably say, look at this idiot, he did something very risky.
Well, for McClellan, though.
Oh, I'm sorry, not for
Yeah.
90,000 people couldn't get one person.
Right. It reinforces the idea that McClellan is bumbling and stumbling his way through this campaign and is so slow to move that he's allowed this cavalry general to ride around his entire army. Obviously, Stuart revels in this particular ride, and yeah, revels in the rebel ride around the army. All right, so in this particular map, we're back in the peninsula. And in the peninsula, we've got Union forces in Henrico and Hanover County knocking on the door of Richmond, right? Lee's Army of Northern Virginia is keeping a defensive line, but that line's paper thin, and they are awaiting reinforcements from Jackson's Stonewall Brigade that are coming out of the valley. So that takes us in to the 7 days that will end the not the Valley campaign, but end the Peninsula campaign. The first battle is the Battle of Oak Grove of the 7 days. It's fought on June 25th, 1862. It's fought in Henrico County. McClellan's trying to launch an attack by telegraph to the front. And that wasn't all that successful. Union forces are bogged down by horrible weather and swampy ground. The attack was not strong enough to derail the Confederate offensive. In this particular series of the campaign, Lee, much like Jackson with smaller forces, is going to launch attacks on the Union front. We move to the next day of the 7 days, June 26th, the Battle of Mechanicsville, or the Battle of Beaver Dam Creek. This particular battle was another Confederate offensive, and now Stonewall Jackson's brigade has moved in. However, I do want you to keep in mind, they're men. They're not robots, right? They're fatigued. They've served in this crazy valley campaign, and now they've crossed over the Piedmont and made their way to just outside of Richmond. These guys are worn out, and that fatigue is going to set in the 7 days. A.P. Hill grows impatient and began his attack without orders. This is a pretty common problem that both Lee and Jackson have. In fact, on both the deathbed of Jackson and Lee, both were heard to have been yelling orders at A.P. Hill before they died. It wasn't their last words, but they were both talking, as they're in some of their not final dying words, but their dying words, they're yelling out orders to A.P. Hill. Jackson arrives late and holds the defensive position. John B. Magruder of Quaker Cannon fame and Benjamin Huger are going to carry out diversionary tactics along the Chickahominy. This doesn't seem like that many casualties for either side, but this is heavy casualties when you look at the numbers for not necessarily the Union, but for the Confederates. A loss of missing, and I put MKW, missing, killed, or wounded, 1,475 Confederates. That's pretty significant. McClellan was pretty much spooked by this attack. He orders General Fitzjohn Porter to pull back and move his base of supply to the James River. So begins McClellan's movement back toward Harrison's Landing, which is where he's going to wind up retreating toward. McClellan now abandons his siege of Richmond. Here we have a soldier's sketch. I love these sketches. I think they're so cool. A soldier's sketch of the Battle of Beaver Dam Creek in Mechanicsville. All right, so we can take a look at this map here. We got Richmond over here. We have the Confederate defensive lines. We have the siege lines of the Union Army. And again, we have the diversionary tactics of Magruder and Huger outside of the Chickahominy River, just east of Richmond. And you can see the offensive being taken place here and the offensive here on June 26th and June 27th. The Battle of Gaines Mill, the next day Lee's going to attack again with 57,000. They'll hit the Union resistance in the swampy ground of Gaines Mill. Jackson again, slow to move into position, but will hold the defensive line. McClellan ordered Porter to hold Gaines Mill at all costs, but it's ultimately going to lead to an assault, and this particular assault is going to lead to John Fitzporter's 5th Corps of 34,000 beating back the repeated Confederate assaults. Again, Thaddeus Lowe is going to use the Intrepid for reconnaissance, and we see massive casualties on both sides of the Battle of Gaines Mill in this particular battle of the 3rd day of the 7 days. A combined missing, killed, wounded, casualty list that dwarfs Bull Run, Wilson's Creek, Ball's Bluff, all 3 of those battles combined. That casualty report will dwarf in 1 day at Gaines Mill. There's the Intrepid, and as Andrew pointed out last class, those are the boxes that they were using the chemicals they're using to inflate the balloon. And Lowe used about 7 balloons during the war. The Intrepid was his favorite. All right, so on June 27th, McClellan orders a retreat towards the James. Little Mac had a 2.5 to 1 superiority of troops south of the river, but he thought he was outnumbered. He left the army with no clear instructions on routes of withdrawal. Porter withdrew across the Chickahominy, burning bridges behind him. And here we have the Union retreat. You can see soldiers lined up. You can see the fires in the background. It was an absolute disorganized mess in a retreat. This just shows you the massive number of forces that fought on June 27th at the Battle of Gaines Mill in the 7 days. And we have Porter's 5th Corps in retreat toward Harrison's Landing. On the 29th, Battle of Savage's Station. Lee tried to attack during the withdrawal. It wasn't well coordinated. Magruder pursued and struck the Union rear guard. Jackson was to hit the flank, but stalled north trying to build a bridge to get across the Chickahominy. Union continued its withdrawal. All corps commanders began to operate independently. Union forces were led by Major Edwin Sumner of the Union rear guard, and this withdrawal continued across White Oak Swamp. Supplies were abandoned. 25,000 soldiers in a field hospital, about 1,500 casualties combined on both sides. And then this is what that field hospital looked like in the 7 days. A lot of them were, yeah. Here we have the Battle of Glendale, or Fraziers Farm. This is on June 30. This is the 6th of the 7 days. Lee launches another assault at Fraziers Farm. Longstreet and Hill's attacks penetrated Union defenses. There was a counterattack, but the Confederate advance stopped on Charles City Road. We also have, this is sort of like Lee's best chance to cut off the Union Army, and there's, again, another day of heavy casualties. This is going to establish a strong position for some high ground on Malvern Hill. So we have another series of maps here. We have the evacuation that we talked about, and then what we're looking at here is the attack on where Jackson's supposed to hit the flank. You can see the Union is set up in defensive positions, and they're going to continue their retreat to Harrison's Landing here on the James, and Lee is going to continue the assaults.
Jackson was just in the mountains.
I know, no, he arrives at the 7 days.
Wait, so how long did it take him to get from Shenandoah or mountains to mountains?
3 days.
Oh.
That's moving. That's why they were exhausted by the time they got there. So he leaves he attacks on that final battle at Cross Keys, and then they scoot out of the valley and they march to Richmond to reinforce.
How did they, because like it just seems so fast for this time period. I mean, like how did they even know that they needed to defend Richmond that fast? Like because
Telegraph,
well, how did they have access to the telegraph?
because they hadn't been telegraphs that, so from telegraph station to telegraph station, couriers could move, and none of those telegraph lines between Richmond and the Valley of Virginia had been, there's no Union occupation anywhere in there.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah. So they're able to get, like, Jackson's able to get Lee's orders that he needs to come back, and this is going to be important too to understand. I think that it's cool, well, not cool, but it's important to see that Jackson's brigade's not invincible. Like, they don't just come back from the valley and they're like, all right, we made it, we're here. You know, they're exhausted. They're sick. You know, they've traversed 650 miles over 3 months, you know, and now they're taking part in these. So that's why during this particular campaign, they are holding defensive positions, they're slow to move, they're not getting into position fast enough because of just the wear and tear that his army had faced.
Also, just because you know this is so mobile, how did the how did this supply work, and how, like, for example, how did they get through this stuff? Because they were just moving so fast, did they just pillage and steal food, or did they?
Not really. I mean, there were still farmers that were providing crops to the and foodstuffs to the army. Obviously, they've got to pick up food along the way. Jackson was a real stickler about if you missed a meal, like the kitchen was shut down. So there's constant times where guys would like sleep in the morning and they didn't eat breakfast because Jackson's kitchen had been packed up, or they might miss supper roll call or dinner roll call. So yeah, they're not always eating, like, you know, they're not always sitting down for a meal, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. A lot of these guys are going to travel with like hardtack and travel with their own, like, you know, their own food. But at this particular time, the military is as better equipped for meals as they had been, or as they will be moving forward. But commissary is a huge problem in the Confederacy across the board. The Confederate commissary was criminal how poor of a job they did getting soldiers food, shoes, uniforms, pretty much anything they needed to make it on the field.
I think that the logistics of this is sort of like really interesting, because you have, like, you know, in this case you probably have 1,000 men, and you know they all, you know, that takes a lot of food and ammunition and other resources.
Well, so on a larger level, like when you think about the logistics of McClellan's army, that's mind-boggling, right? But even with Jackson, like his force of 16 to 17,000, not only the supply, but how rapid they're moving is just unbelievable.
Yeah, that's a lot
and
of
that,
calories.
right? Yeah, caloric intake. I mean, that's like, think about that too. Like, what if us as a group decided for the next 3 months that we were going to try to travel 33 miles a day on foot? Now, it wasn't every single day, but there were a lot of days where they were traveling 33 miles a day. We'd be hungry.
Yeah, and plus also
Probably want to punch
like
them.
hardtack and the stuff that they would, you know, that wouldn't be nutritious, you know, it wouldn't really
Right.
advise the nutrition stuff.
So that does raise a pretty important point here, that the armies are, thank you, the armies are going to be getting, people are going to be selling them food all along the way, right? So there are wagons of farmers and merchants that are selling goods to the army in the valley and in the towns and cities. And soldiers are going to try to figure out ways of their own to like find food as well. That brings up a really good point. Do they forage? Do they pillage? Do they plunder? Of course they do. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I'll get that in a second. All right, so this is a Union wagon train outside of Malvern Hill. And this takes us to the final day of the 7 days, Malvern Hill. The Union Army's bottlenecked at Malvern Hill in Henrico County. And really, the Confederate effort was pretty poor following the Battle of Glendale. Soldiers were weak from disease, fatigue on both sides. Magruder and Stonewall Jackson moved slowly, following up the Charles City road route via the Chickahominy. Huger failed to participate in the battle. Confederate General A.P. Hill and James Longstreet, Old Pete, were able to follow Lee's orders to attack Union concentration. And the Battle of Malvern Hill began on July 1st at 4:30 in the afternoon. John Fitzporter had time to prepare. Timbers were cut for better visibility on the slopes for artillery and for volley. Artillery had a range of open fire on the field. All of the Army was on the hill except for the 4th Corps. Union artillery began bombardment for an hour-and-a-half barrage. 3 U.S. gunboats, the Galena, the Jacob Bell, and the Roostook, added more firepower. And we'll talk more about gunboats as we move forward.
How did they name it the Jacob Bell? Because everything else has just been like, oh,
That's a good question.
That's the thing. And then it's just like some random dude's name.
Yeah, let's take a look at that. We'll check that out here in a minute. So Magruder was to follow Jackson to deploy to his right. Huger's division was to follow, these are the Confederate generals, to follow up the position based on developments, and Longstreet and Hill held in defensive reserve. Confederate troops reached within about 100 or 200 yards of the Union center before nightfall. This was really hard fighting. The Confederates are defeated here, and they will retreat to Richmond. The Union will retreat to Harrison's Landing. Brutal fighting, casualties heavier on the Confederate side than the Union side. 56,000, or 5,600 rather, Confederate to 2,100 Union. These are the troop movements and forces that were at Malvern Hill on July 1st. This is 2 Pennsylvania soldiers, Union soldiers. I wanted to pull this picture. It just shows the sheer exhaustion of the guy seated, the sheer exhaustion of the 7 days. This picture was taken after Malvern Hill, after the 7 days battle. The Confederates suffered more than 5,300 casualties without gaining an inch of ground at Malvern Hill. Despite his victory, McClellan withdrew and entrenched at Harrison's Landing on the James, where the Army was protected by gunboats, ending the Peninsula Campaign. Any idea what McClellan asked for? Reinforcements. Excellent. He wants more soldiers, and Lincoln is not interested. Here's another image of Harrison's Landing. The origin of TAPS comes out of this particular campaign as well. I don't know if you're familiar with Daniel Butterfield. We'll talk more about Butterfield later. Butterfield's the guy that has his bugler, Oliver W. Norton. Butterfield and Norton create these musical melodies to let his group know where they are on the field. So we're like taps is a example of one of those that is now used for fallen soldiers. Another one that you're probably familiar with is you know that trumpet sound, that bugle sound. Well, that bugle sound was made by Butterfield and Norton because he wanted his men to be able to come back together. So the particular sound of that, those notes are supposed to be Butterfield, 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 so they would all come back together. I know I've got some brilliant minds in music here, so maybe you guys would be interested. I'm looking at you, Donovan. Maybe you guys would be interested in like pulling, or maybe we could pull those sheets to take a look at those notes, because I don't know exactly what those notes look like, but that reveille signal was to try to bring his guys back together. And Norton and Butterfield, they're going to come up with taps, and we still use taps today to honor our fallen veterans. All right, so that is where we will pump the brakes.